Now we've got to pause right now because there's one more sinister plot that's lurking in the shadows, and that is we need to know who gave birth to the United Nations, who was the author of the charter, and maybe it's a good idea to have a world government structure. I mean, they're telling us everywhere where we must think globally right now. They're telling us that the days for sovereignty are over, that it's dangerous. Such prestigious papers as the New York Times are telling us the time has come, we've got to surrender some of our sovereignty. Strobe Talbot, on and on, we hear these things. So the big question is, should we surrender our sovereignty to the United Nations? What would the consequences be? And what is this structure really? What will the end result be? We've got to talk about that. Now, in order to tell you, we need to know exactly how the birth came about. What happened was at Yalta. Now, Yalta is where President Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill met to recarve the map of Europe. And when they met there, they not only drew the new boundaries of Europe, but they decided to give birth to the United Nations. Now, at Yalta, President Roosevelt was a dying man. 10 weeks later, he died. He had a young diplomatic shining star at his right arm who was the Henry Kissinger of his day, and he carried the bulk of the negotiations for President Roosevelt and for the United States of America. Now, I don't want to get ahead of my story here because this is a little complex, but it's very, very important for me to convey to you. Because of this man's brilliance, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill decided this would be the perfect individual to write a constitution, a charter for the one world governmental system that they hoped to give birth to, called the United Nations. This man did write the charter. He was the presiding Secretary General at the first meeting of the United Nations in 1945, and everything seemed wonderful. There was one big problem that cropped up 2 or 3 years later. This young man was convicted of lying about communist spying activities. Even though he was Roosevelt's right-hand man, it was proven that he was a communist spy and had sent secret information to the Soviet Union. This is the man that wrote the charter for the United Nations, and when he wrote it, he designed it to be a one-world government, a union of socialist world republics is what he designed it to be. He intended for the whole world to live under world communism. It was so interesting that when he designed the emblem for the United Nations, the emblem for the USSR was a globe with 2 sheaves of wheat around it with a hammer and sickle superimposed. The emblem of the United Nations was a globe with 2 olive branches around it. Mr. Alger Hiss left off the hammer and the sickle. It would have been a little bit too obvious way back there in 1945. Consequently, the United Nations was designed to be a realization of the world Marxist dream of a world union of socialist republics, an international communistic movement, and that is what the birth of the United Nations represents. You know, it's been said, what you don't know won't hurt you. However, when we begin to move through all these things, Eddie, that about the United Nations, maybe what we don't know could in fact hurt us.
There's no doubt about it. One of the things I remember that you had mentioned in this article was there was a secret agreement made when the United Nations was being formed that Alger Hiss incorporated into, not officially into the charter, but there was actually a secret agreement that the position at the United Nations, it was Undersecretary General of something, some long title, but this is the guy who was in charge of all of the whole UN army, the entire military operation. It was agreed that this man would always be a communist. It would be held by a communist, and 14 out of 15 of these Undersecretary Generals were from the Soviet Union.
We're talking about over the last 50 years.
Yes.
Now. 14 out of 15 have been communist.
That's right. 14 from communist Soviet Union, 1 communist Yugoslavia.
And so that agreement's been kept because the communists want their control on the trigger, on the armed forces of the United Nations.
And that wasn't even revealed until I think the first Secretary General of the UN, Trevioli, wrote that in his memoirs.
And what a lot of people don't realize is that the United States is not very popular at the UN. We, together with Israel, get outvoted nearly every time. This world government structure is going to be a socialistic democratic socialism, it's actually going to be the realization of the dream of Karl Marx. If it in fact ends up having total power, we are going to move into a world communistic government. I know those are harsh and strong words, but it's very important to realize, a lot of people say, well, maybe socialist, but not communist. I would just like to tell you that the word communism was never used one time in Karl Marx's book, The Communist Manifesto. Every time he called it democratic socialism. Now then, everybody you say democratic socialism, they smile benignly and say, how sweet. No communism, but democratic socialism. You know, the real fact is, we're not even shocked by communism anymore, Eddie. We've gotten over the fear of communism itself.
One of the most loved people on the earth, Mikhail Gorbachev, openly says, I'm a communist. It's just nothing to be scared of.
And Nelson Mandela, the hero of South Africa, he spoke at the opening of the Communist Party in South Africa. I have his picture with giving the raised fist salute with the hammer and the sickle in the background.
That was just after he was released from prison.
Yes, absolutely. Because he is a communist or a socialist, whichever you choose to call it, but there is no difference. It's the exact same thing. Now, there's more to this prophecy, however, that we need to see that is really going to bring it up to date for you. In the book of Revelation, chapter 13, we're going to read one more verse. This is verse number 3. Listen to it.
And I saw one of his heads, as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast.
Now, this is so interesting. Many people have taught from this scripture, Eddie, that the antichrist will be killed and will raise from the dead, and that's the reason the whole world will follow him. We need to read this scripture again real close, because it does not say here that the antichrist will be wounded and raised from the dead. It says this beast has 7 heads, and one of the heads will be wounded nigh unto death, or wounded unto death. The deadly wound will be healed. So the big question is, which head will be wounded to death? If we don't know what the heads are, there is no way in the world we can understand what God is attempting to say to us here. Now let's review. There are 7 heads. We know what they are. 1 for the lion, 1 for the bear, 4 for the leopard, 1 for the 10-horned beast. So pick among those. Is there any of those that has been wounded to death? Well, the fact is, the answer is yes. At the end of World War II, it was concluded by the Allies that there was something basically wrong in the German soul. There was a problem there. You know, Eddie, they said, why in the world does Germany always start these wars? They had started the Franco-German War of 1870, World War I, World War II. The leaders of the Allies said, we got to stop this. There's something wrong here.
So what they did was they decided kind of a radical solution. They cut Germany in half. They actually drew a line right smack down through the middle of Germany and said, we're going to separate her. And so if we do that, she'll never be able to come back to full force and do it again.
Yeah, that was actually their plan. They planned to cut Germany in half and so weaken both halves. They put East Germany in the communist sphere of influence, West Germany on the Allied sphere of influence, and they reduced the population and the financial base so dramatically that neither side was strong enough to threaten world peace again. That was the deadly wound. The headline screamed back in those days, Germany is dead, she will never rise again. However, it wasn't long before the Germans began to clamor for reunification. Now, this went on for quite a while. Of course, not only was Germany divided, but Europe was divided. The dreaded Iron Curtain. I think it was in 1961, there were so many people fleeing from the tyranny of the communist East into the Western sector that one morning we awoke to the news that Russia, that the Soviet Union, was building a wall down through the heart of Berlin, a 29-mile wall, in order to force the people to stay in the communist slavery. Now, when they built this wall, it was a terrible thing. It shocked the entire world. It was a wall of shame. Then Germany remained divided all the way up until 1989. We continued to hear about the necessity. The time has come.